Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this panel on rising sea levels and disappearing territories, implications for statehood and international law. I'm Bryce Rudick. I'm the Senior Fellow and Adjunct Professor at the NYU School of Law and the Senior Legal Advisor at the Alliance of Small Island States. As we begin, I'd like to thank ASIL for having us and to Julian Simcock, the annual committee member who organized this panel. Recent scientific estimates suggest that the global mean sea level rise could exceed 2 meters by 2100. Of course, this is a global mean rise, so we will see localized rises in addition to that, as well as we will likely see storm surges. This does not bode well for the small island states of the world. Maldives, which I represent at the UN, has a highest point above sea level of 2.4 meters and an average of 1.2 meters. In Kiribati, the average is 2 meters, and already in the Republic of the Marshall Islands, their only airport floods during king tides and storm surges. But of course, long before the last bit of these islands slips below the seas, they will become inhabitable. Water lenses will disappear along with arable land and then eventually inhabitable land. Our panel today will focus on the question of what international law's response will be to sinking states. Well, we know from the Montevideo Convention that there are requirements for establishing a state. What happens when one of these requirements, in this case land, disappears? Our excellent panelists today are going to look at this from 4 different angles. Directly to my left, I have Alejandra Torres Camprudi, who is an associate in the international litigation and arbitration practice at Foley Hoag. Next to her is Andreas Kravik, who is the legal advisor at the Norwegian mission to the United Nations. Next to Andreas, we have Miriam Traore Chazanuel, thematic specialist on migration, environment, and climate change at the International Organization for Migration. And then at the end, we have Sumudu Atapatu, who is the Director of Research Centers and International Programs at the University of Wisconsin Law School. The panelists have all agreed to speak for no longer than 15 minutes, and I will be diligent in holding them to that time so that we have enough time for questions and discussion from the audience. So, Alejandra.
Thank you very much, Bryce. First of all, I would like to thank the Society for inviting me to speak on a topic that is very dear to me, surrounded by fantastic co-panelists who actually work directly with the affected states. And thank you, Bryce, for suggesting that I open this panel. In the few minutes that I have, I will focus on how sea level rise constitutes an existential threat for low-lying island states, particularly those located in the Pacific, and how the international law of the sea may be used by these affected states to protect their maritime spaces and rights over those spaces. Back in 1970, Professor Charles Rousseau wrote that duration is an essential element of the state. La durée est un élément essentiel de l'État. This quote translates, in my view, the traditional view of the state as a firm institution, a power-based institution, perhaps even as a monolithical structure with a vocation to persist in time. And some authors actually even argue that there is an international law, a presumption of continuity of statehood, derived from international law's inherent bias towards stability and order. And yet, the history of 20th century international relations may seem to indicate exactly the opposite. It may actually seem to indicate better than any other previous historical period that states actually come and go quite often. And this is particularly shown, of course, by the disappearance of 4 empires after the First World War, the whole decolonization process in the second half of the 20th century, and more recently by the disintegration of both the USSR and the former Yugoslavia. All of these events which have made that there are now today 3 times more independent states than there were back in 1914. And yet, These cases are, in my view, examples of processes of redistribution of power into different territorial units. Sea level rise, in contrast, poses a very different type of challenge, namely the threat of the material disintegration of the state. This unprecedented scenario constitutes the present ontological and existential challenge that a particular category of states, post-colonial low-lying island states, are facing. 4 states in the world are particularly endangered as they are exclusively or almost exclusively composed by coral islands and atolls, which are below 10 meters of altitude. Tuvalu, Kiribati, and the Marshall Islands in the Pacific Ocean, and the Maldives in the Indian Ocean. Eventually, as scenarios of total submergence and total depopulation become a reality, sea level rise will challenge the correlation between statehood as a physical reality and statehood as a legal construct. Low-lying island states have expressed their concern about the challenge that sea level rise poses to their continuity as states since the late 80s, even before the UNFCCC was adopted at the Rio Conference in 1992. Yet the issue of loss of statehood due to sea level rise has gained particular attention again in the last few years. First, as Bryce pointed out, because of the publication in 2014 of the 5th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which foresaw an increase of around 1 meter of sea level by 100 when compared to 1919 levels. The second reason is also because more recently, the Alliance of Small Island States fought very hardly and managed to get loss and damage incorporated in the Paris Agreement, now in Article 8, which is actually a self-standing provision that is autonomous from climate adaptation. So loss of statehood is now, has now been fully acknowledged and recognized and is actually part of the climate change regime. So what is the role to play by the international law on statehood to address this challenge? The burden of attributing legal consequences to a very complex range of facts that contribute to both the creation and the extinction of states is what is often called or known as the law on statehood. The law on statehood therefore deals with the birth and death of the primary subject of international law, the original subject of international law, the state. And as a result of that, it is, of course, a highly controversial area of international law. Putting aside the debate on the legal or non-legal nature on the law on statehood, a fact that leaves no room for doubt is that the question of state creation has received much more attention in legal scholarship than the question of state extinction. And it is perhaps due to this disproportion that, as a result, nowadays, positivists, in my view, too much of a formalist voices argue that Pacific Island states will simply be extinguished once total submergence or total depopulation takes place. However, in practice, things are not as straightforward. The law is not so clear-cut. Professor and Judge James Crawford, in his very famous treatise on the creation of states in international law, he devotes one very tiny last chapter to the extinction of states in international law, and he wrote that, and I quote, "A state is not necessarily extinguished by substantial changes in territory, population or government, or even in some cases by a combination of all three." This is, of course, because of the cardinal importance played by the normative standards, the ethical and the diplomatic framework in which claims of both access to statehood and loss of it are framed. And indeed, one cannot explain how these very micro-states were recognized as independent states with full UN membership, this in spite of not necessarily fulfilling the capacity requirement of Article 4 of the UN Charter, if it wasn't because territory for these states constituted, and actually still constitutes, an expression of their right to independence from colonial domination. In addition, In spite of the very limited land extension, Pacific Island states actually benefited from the expansionist evolution of the international law of the sea towards the distribution of sovereignty and jurisdiction over maritime spaces that culminated with the adoption in 1982 of the Law of the Sea Convention. So disproportionately vast maritime spaces were allocated to these new states, which compensated for their very limited land extension. Very paradoxically, these states, which are often called, by the way, the ocean states, for these states, the sea is both the fundamental element of the national identity and primary source of their livelihoods, as it is also the main threat to their existence and their continuity as a people and as a state. So protecting their maritime spaces and rights over such spaces is therefore of crucial importance for these states. It is also the first step towards the preservation of their continuity. So how can Pacific Island states protect their maritime rights through any kind of tools? In addition to the physical and engineering devices, such as the construction of seawalls, the extensive mangrove plantation, legal tools derived from the law of the sea can also be used and are already being used by the affected states. As we all know, the cardinal principle of the law of the sea is that the land dominates the sea and does so by the intermediary of the coastal front, to use the famous description by Prosper Vale. Sea level rise poses a problem to this. First, as sea level rises, the low water line along the coast, which marks the normal baseline, will move inland. Given that normal baselines are considered as ambulatory, the outer maritime limits which have been measured from those baselines will move inland accordingly. And as a result of that, areas which were before under national jurisdiction may become high seas. These movements will be even more substantial if key features used for the construction of straight baselines are inundated or lost. And the same principle, of course, would apply to archipelagic baselines, as the loss of key points may alter the land-water ratio provided for in the Law of the Sea Convention. So what can be done? This is a question that is currently being examined by the Committee on International Law and Sea Level Rise of the International Law Association, and Professor David Caron was one of our eminent members, and he's greatly missed, and he was also, of course, one of the visionaries who saw this issue coming back in the early 90s. The first means through which Pacific Island states can protect their maritime spaces is, of course, through the conclusion of maritime delimitation treaties. And it seems to have been actually the privileged path taken by these states. For more than 40 years, the only maritime delimitation agreements that existed in this area had been the ones concluded by former colonies and around the enclave territories that were left in the region. And yet, since 2006, around 10 new maritime delimitation agreements have been concluded in the area by Pacific Island states, newly independent Pacific Island states. So there is a real explosion of maritime delimitation agreements in the area. The idea behind concluding maritime delimitation treaties is, of course, that sea level rise would not qualify as a circumstance constituting a fundamental change of circumstances. Therefore, Article 62 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of the Treaties would not be invoked as grounds for terminating or withdrawing from a treaty. But what happens when we do not have a maritime boundary, but only a maritime limit, where there has been no delimitation of the overlapping maritime zones between two adjacent or opposing states? And here's where a dilemma arises. Option one is to preserve the existing baseline, and option two would be to preserve the outer limit. We generally refer to one or another as either the freezing baselines option or the freezing of the baseline of the outer maritime limits option. there are pros and cons to both, to these two options. Of course, the preservation or the freezing, arguing for the freezing of the baseline would mean that the breadth of the internal waters would increase, and that the chartered baseline would be divorced from the actual baseline, would not correspond anymore to the low water line. On the contrary, the preservation or the freezing of the outer limit would, on the one hand, be positive for the stability of the borders that will be preserved, but on the other hand, it would, of course, have the consequences of expanding the breadth of the maritime spaces, exceeding the limits provided in the Law of the Sea Convention. I would be happy to leave for the discussion more of the pros and cons of these two options and what the regional practice has been. So just as a word of conclusion, it is often considered that the jeopardy or the threat to that loss of statehood due to sea level rise is a very extreme option, and in any case a scenario that would only really affect a very few number of states, 4, maybe 5 states, and that as a result of this it is not a fundamental question of international law. I see the sinking island paradigm, which has emerged and is here to stay, as one of the latest and perhaps the most paradigmatic image of today's postmodern global environmental crisis. And although it affects only a very small group of states, this paradigm is a symbol of both the limits or borders of international law, as it is a symbol of the excesses of our civilization. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alejandra. Andreas.
Thank you very much, Bryce, and thank you to ASIL for inviting me, and thank you to my fellow panelists for who are very distinguished and accomplished scholars for treating a mere practitioner like myself as an equal. I'm truly honored and humbled to be here today. Being a legal counselor for Norway to the United Nations, and thus coming at this topic, both as a diplomat and as an international lawyer to the UN, I wanted to discuss how the UN, and more specifically the Security Council, can tackle some of the security implications of climate change. But before I proceed, let me just offer 2 quick caveats. One, Norway has not been on the Security Council since 2001, and I therefore claim no particular knowledge about the inner deliberations of the Council. And secondly, I should also say that whatever I say here today is attributable to me only and not to my ministry. So just to make sure I can go back and have a job. But this panel focuses on rising sea levels and disappearing territories. And I think we can all agree that these are particularly impactful consequences of climate change. But there are other consequences, such as hurricanes, dwindling natural resources, and drought, which could be equally menacing for some countries. The point here is that for several countries, changes to the climate can give rise to existential security threats. And for the purposes of my topic, I don't see any reason to distinguish between rising sea levels and other security threats arising from climate change. So to simplify, I'll treat these security implications as a whole and just refer to them as security implications deriving from climate change. I trust most of you are familiar with the mandate and the competence of the Security Council, but just let me recap shortly. Pursuant to the UN Charter, the Security Council is the only body of the UN that can adopt binding coercive measures. Article 24 of the Charter gives the Council primary responsibility for ensuring international peace and security. The Council's classic domain has been interstate armed conflict. Country A attacks country B, that's a typical issue for the Security Council. But starting in the early 90s, the Council began to show a greater willingness to prescribe forcible measures also in internal situations of conflict and humanitarian emergency. Today, there are several intrastate issues on the Council's agenda, for example, Burundi, Haiti, Afghanistan, and we more or less take it for granted that these are situations where the Council is engaged. So far, however, the Council has been reluctant to tackle climate change. At first glance, this makes sense. The perception by most people, including UN diplomats and UN lawyers even, is that the Council deals with hard security, drones, bombs, aggressors, and so forth, not technical and science-like phenomena such as sea level rise, storms, and droughts. Upon closer examination, however, this is just manifestly incorrect. Although climate is seldom the singular cause for conflict, it can certainly be a contributing factor. And ongoing hostilities in Libya, South Sudan, Yemen, and Syria were all, to some degree, catalyzed by extraordinary droughts, storms, and extreme flooding, which caused turmoil and instability and eventually conflict. Yet, we know that all these conflicts are recurring items on the Security Council's agenda. So seen this way, the Council is already engaged on the topic of climate change. But treating the violent symptoms of climate change is one thing. Another is prescribing measures to prevent climate change as an independent driver of conflict. And a second topic is the Council's ability to address security implications of climate change outside of conflict. This latter point is especially important for most of the so-called small island developing states, usually abbreviated SIDS, as referred to by Bryce and others, whose very existence are threatened by sea level rise, hurricanes, and dwindling natural resources. Their remote geographical location and small populations suggest that they could gradually deteriorate without causing much conflict or international instability. So, to what extent then has the Council been willing to address climate change, both as an independent driver of conflict and also additionally outside of the parameters of conflict? Let us start by examining what the members of the Security Council, as well as other UN member states, have said about this topic. It was only in 2007 that the Council held its first ever debate about the security impacts of climate change. The session was chaired by then British Foreign Secretary Margaret Beckett. In her lead-in, Beckett referred to climate change as, and I quote, exacerbating many threats, including conflict, and she underlined that the Council needed to build a shared understanding of the relationship between energy, security, and climate. Papua New Guinea, speaking for the so-called Pacific SIDS, said that the impact of climate change on small island developing states was no less threatening than the dangerous guns and bombs posed to large nations. Many other countries were sympathetic to this line of thinking, including all the Nordic countries and several Latin American countries. Other states were much more doubtful. The Chinese representative said that climate change could have certain security implications, but generally speaking, it is, in essence, an issue of sustainable development. Pakistan, speaking for the so-called Group of 77, a broad coalition of predominantly developing countries, said that the Security Council was not the right forum. Russia expressed similar concerns and said tellingly that the Council should only deal with issues under its mandate. And not until 2011 did the Council return to the topic of climate change and security, this time in an open debate initiated by Germany. Although 4 years had passed, amongst the skeptics, the debate only showed at best incremental willingness to tolerate a greater role for the Security Council in addressing climate change. Russia and China especially were adamant that that climate change was predominantly a development issue outside of the purview of the Council. For the PSIDS, Pacific Small Island Developing States, this was deeply unsatisfactory. In a clear call to action, the president of Nauru, Marcus Stephen, described climate change as great a threat as nuclear proliferation and terrorism and urged the Council to coordinate the requisite international response. The Council did agree to a presidential statement, although it was a clear nod to those opposed to a more engaged Council. After protracted negotiations, the Council could only bring itself to say, and here I quote, "The possible adverse effects of climate change may, in the long run, aggravate certain existing threats to international peace and security." The statement said nothing about potential measures by the climate to mitigate the security effects of climate change. Then Ambassador Susan Rice from the US likely spoke for many delegations when she characterized the statement as pathetic. After the 2011 debate, the Council has only debated climate change under the so-called area formula, which are informal meetings not on the Council's official agenda. There were meetings held in 2013 and 2015, but nothing much was accomplished, and the various countries seemed entrenched in their positions. And that brings us to 2017 and the adoption of Security Council Resolution 2349, which I think is very important in this regard. The resolution concerned the security implications and situation in the Lake Chad region. In the resolution's operative paragraph 26, the Council said the following: the Council recognizes the adverse effects of climate change and ecological changes, among other factors, on the stability of the region, including through water scarcity, drought and desertification, land degradation, and food insecurity, and emphasizes the need for adequate risk assessment and risk management strategies by governments and the United Nations relating to those factors. I think the paragraph is important for two reasons. One, it contains the first recognition by the Council that there is a clear correlation between the effects of climate change and regional security. And second, the Security Council for the first time encouraged governments to take active measures to prevent and manage environmental risk factors. But one should also not exaggerate the legal consequences of the resolution. The climate measures were not prescribed as legally binding obligations. Instead, the Council did little more than trying to nudge the governments into taking action against climate change. It is also worth noting that the Sahel region is a war-torn region and that the Security Council engaged on climate change in this context. So for SIDS and other coastal states where the risk of conflict is remote, the resolution might therefore hold limited relevance. Still, I would argue that the resolution marks a significant shift in the Council's approach to climate change as a driver of conflict and a generic threat to security. But what then about other situations where there is no impending conflict? Here the Council has thus far been reluctant to call on states to enact climate measures. However, the Council's handling of other non-conventional security threats indicates that this could in fact change. And I'll briefly mention two resolutions which I think are important in this regard. The first is Resolution 1983, adopted as far back as in 2011. The resolution concerned the impacts of HIV/AIDS on international peace and security. The Council recognized that HIV was one of the more formidable challenges to the development, progress, and stability of societies and required an exceptional and comprehensive global response. The Council welcomed and encouraged cooperation amongst member states to achieve sustainable HIV and AIDS prevention. And the second resolution, which I think deserves highlighting, is Resolution 2177, which was adopted by the Council in 2014 in response to a deadly Ebola outbreak in Africa. In the resolution, the Council characterized the epidemic as a threat to international peace and security. In a string of operative paragraphs, the Council called on the international community to provide various kinds of assistance and resources to support the affected countries. It should be noted that in this resolution, as was the case in Resolution 1983 about HIV, the Council refrained from prescribing any legal obligations to assist the affected countries. Still, the two resolutions are significant. By addressing HIV and Ebola as issues of international peace and security, despite only incidental risks of conflict, the Council expanded its traditional area of competence beyond the limited sphere of armed conflict. There were no bombs, there were no aggressor states, there were no weapons, yet the Council acted. So what are the takeaways? What are the conclusions that we can draw from this? I'll offer four takeaways. One, the Council is still far away from taking assertive steps against climate change. I think we should all recognize that. But second, the trend lines are clear. The Council has now unequivocally recognized the international security implications of climate change, and at one occasion urged governments to take cooperative measures to mitigate climate change. And three, the Council still views climate change through a lens of conflict prevention. This is clear from the statements given during the open debates in 2007, 2011, as well as in Resolution 2349. This is in keeping with the Council's traditional role. For those most threatened by climate change, such as SIDS, this is still deeply concerning. And that brings me to my fourth and last takeaway, namely that the Council's responses to HIV and Ebola indicate that the Council could be willing to address climate change also outside of the parameters of armed conflict. Should the security effects of climate change become clearer than they are now and more hazardous. As a final point, let me just offer some brief thoughts about what the Council could do if it decided to act against climate change. A wide range of measures would be at its disposal. It could oblige countries to take climate-friendly actions, including legislative measures, enact sanctions against individuals or entities that fail to comply with certain international environmental standards, and/or issue condemnations of certain behavior or inaction. In exceptional cases, one could also envision the authorization of military action against states or even non-state actors whose environmental unfriendly actions cause grave and immediate danger. Now, some might argue that this is all wishful thinking and that the chances of decisive Council action against climate change are bleak. But we know that the Council, after all, is the highest arbiter of international security. So the question I pose is, can it remain credible without addressing what by most accounts is the biggest security threat of our time? Thank you.
Thank you, Andreas. Miriam.
Hi everyone, my name is Mariam and I work at the International Organization for Migration, the IOM. It's the largest United Nations agency dealing with migration, and it's from this perspective that I will be speaking today. Just as Andreas, I work in New York and I follow negotiations. So I'm not a legal specialist, but I follow negotiations that pertain to climate change on the one hand and migration on the other hand. And within these discussions, there's a lot of relevance to the topic that we are discussing today. As far as I can see, the whole debate around statehood disappearing, states, sea level rise and so on, is very much linked to the migration dimension, because we're also talking about most likely arranging for planning, preparing orderly migration before the states disappear, so people don't just wait out on the islands to disappear. So from this perspective, I wanted to just discuss a little bit what's going on in the global climate negotiations and in the global migration negotiations. Alejandra, you spoke a little bit about the UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Everyone here is aware that the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015. For the migration community, it was a really big milestone. Why? Because this agreement, for the first time in the global climate negotiations, offers several references to migration, which are also relevant to this question of disappearing states. So first of all, in the preamble of this agreement, there's a reference to the need for states to protect the rights of migrants when taking action on climate change. The rights of migrants, I mean, there are no agreed definition of who a migrant is, but we can maybe think that these people who are in this territory, which might disappear, they might be considered as migrants. So that might be one element of relevance. And then another important advance that was achieved in the Paris Agreement was a decision to create a working group. I'm not going to go into the details because it's a lot of blah blah. But essentially, a working group was created linked to the loss and damage agenda that you mentioned. And this specific working group is called the Task Force on Disaster Displacement. And it's about developing recommendations and discuss and gather evidence on how the international community can respond to migration, forced migration, linked to climate change. So that's what's going on in a nutshell in the global climate negotiations side. On the other hand, at the moment, within the United Nations, there's a really big process about negotiating a new agreement on international migration. These negotiations are in process. Actually, they are happening right now in New York. So I'm just going to summarize briefly what has been happening until now, with a caveat that will probably change as states revise the actual text of the compact. So this migration negotiation is called the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration, the GCM in short. Before the negotiation started, migration practitioners were not entirely sure that climate change and disasters will be addressed in this migration negotiations. Why? Because in the migration community, there was a lot of talking at the international organizations level, at the level of the academia, of civil society and so on, about the impacts of climate change on migration. But states were very much reluctant to take up these issues. Why? Mostly because of these questions of not creating new legal categories, basically not expanding the Refugee Convention. Because the Refugee Convention, as it stands now, doesn't provide access for people to claim refugee status on the basis of climate change. There are some exceptions to these rules if these movements are linked to, for instance, to public unrest and so on. But let's say that generally speaking, if you're a person displaced by climate change, you would not be able to claim a refugee status. So the situation there was that very few states, and not even the Pacific States, wants to expand this definition of refugees. For the Pacific States, they don't want that because they don't want to be seen as victims of climate change. They prefer to focus on this notion of migration with dignity, meaning that they want to be helped, they want to be supported, but they do not want to be seen as helpless victims. So that was the context. However, about 3 months ago, when these negotiations actually started, and we looked at the text, we realized that there was a lot of references to the climate change impacts, and notably to the questions of protection. How do you provide legal international protection to people who are not covered under the Refugee Convention, but who are actually not covered under anything else? There was an acknowledgement that there is a big gap there, but of course the issue is how do you fill these gaps? So this is still an ongoing discussion, but what I've noticed is that first, at the beginning, many states were saying absolutely not, we're not going to look at the question of protection of these climate forcibly displaced persons, because we don't want to create new legal obligations on ourselves, and this is not the appropriate forum. But as time went by, negotiations after negotiations, we see less and less reluctance to look at these issues. Yesterday, during the second day of the current negotiations, I only heard one state saying, let's not talk about it. So it looks likely that these migration negotiations will be touching upon the question of legal protection of people migrating or displaced in the context of climate change. With the caveat that no new instruments will be developed or promoted, but it would be probably a question of highlighting the existing tools like temporary protection status, or even I think Norway has some kind of special humanitarian measures for people coming from some countries which are affected by natural disasters, for instance. So this is the road where this is all going. But what is interesting for us here is the willingness to look at questions of legal protection, even if there are a lot of discussions around whether the principle of non-refoulement should apply or not. I mean, these discussions are ongoing. However, what I have not heard, neither in the climate change debate or the migration debate, even if the Pacific States are very vocal, they do highlight the fact that they are facing existential threat. However, no one is quite ready to actually really look into the question of what do we do if the territory disappear. It feels like there is a mental blockage somewhere, which means that we are ready to discuss, what do we do to help these people, if they need to migrate, if they need to move, to relocate within the country, and so on. But no real discussions on the actual, what happened if that states disappear. Having said that, I think, that's my personal opinion, just like you, I'm representing myself here. I think, considering that a few years ago, really very, in the global policy area, no one was really interested in this question. As you say, like, people thought it would only concern a few Pacific states, and climate and migration was not really a big issue. But in the past 5 years, there's been so much more acknowledgement, recognition of these discussions in text negotiated within the United Nations. But I'm quite hopeful that this question of disappearing state would one day, slowly but surely maybe, will be discussed in a more official way. So at the moment, I would say that we are moving forward in terms of global governance of climate migration, but we are not quite ready yet in terms of political will to be looking at concrete action and the legal implications of a disappearing state. I just want to conclude by saying that in terms of analysis of legal solutions to support people migrating in the context of climate change, there's been quite a lot of research and documents written, notably within the context of this initiative called the Nansen Initiative, which has basically analyzed a number of existing legal practices around the world and see how they could be replicated in other parts of the world. So again, the ambition here is not to create a new legal obligations, but to consolidate what is already existing. You also have quite a lot of work from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. The Human Rights Council is looking at questions of climate and displacement. To the best of my knowledge, I don't think they are touching upon the question of disappearing state, but maybe that will be something in the future. And in my own organization, the IOM, we also called upon by individual states to review their legislations, whether it's migration or climate legislations, to bring up these concepts together. So there is work done at the conceptual level, at the practical level, and at the level of supporting directly the states trying to develop legislation and policy on these questions. So I think that will be it for me. I promised that I will be the shortest because I want to win something. So.
Oh. I may have to rustle up a prize in the next few minutes. And Sumudu, thank you.
Thank you very much, Bryce, and thank you all for coming here today. Your presentation actually was a nice segue for mine because I'm going to talk about human rights, and actually Bryce asked me to talk about human rights and also the North-South dimension of this whole thing. So to take a step back and look at the relationship between human rights and climate change, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights actually came up with a report in 2009, I believe, on the relationship between the two. Since then, of course, we have now a provision in the Paris Agreement linking the two specifically. But, I mean, it's a very general thing to say that, the climate change will have an impact on human rights. Obviously, when you look at all the consequences of climate change, I mean, it's pretty obvious that most of the rights that are protected under international human rights law will be affected by climate change, whether you look at sea level rise, which is a subject of this panel, or day-to-day issues like access to water, access to food, and even health issues, and in extreme cases, right to life would be affected as well. But that doesn't mean that international human rights law is the best approach to deal with climate change, or that the obligations under international human rights law are sort of clarified in relation to climate change. So I think it's important to look at the limitations of the human rights framework as well, because human rights law operates vertically. You have your state as the duty bearer and the citizens or people who live in the country as rights holders. So, and also human rights law for most part operates territorially. So that means if the threat comes from outside, what do you do? That's one of the limitations. And then I think it's important to look at different aspects of climate change in relation to mitigation, adaptation, severe weather events, and damage that we are already witnessing as a result of historic emissions when we talk about human rights obligations. The last one that I mentioned, that the damage we are witnessing right now as a result of climate change, that's the hardest part to sort of reconcile with human rights obligations. Because as we all know, climate change is a global problem. Everybody is contributing to the problem. At the same time, everybody is a victim, but not necessarily to the same degree. But states have accepted mitigation commitments. And whether we like it or not, we have locked in a certain amount of climate change because of the emissions that are already there. That's why we are witnessing these consequences now. So states have to protect its people in terms of these severe weather events that we have been witnessing all over the world and in the US as well, although we tend to believe that we are immune to the impacts of climate change here. So both in terms of adaptation and severe weather events, states do have human rights obligations to protect its people. And then in terms of mitigation commitments that states have made, they have to ensure that although these commitments may be good for climate change, we should ensure that rights of people are not affected by these mitigation measures. So I think that's where the human rights framework comes into play. And then if you look at the small island states, of course, their situation is unique, I think, because in addition to being affected as individuals, individuals of these small island states, their rights are being affected. They are also being affected by being part of these small islands themselves, because if your state is disappearing and your state is the guardian of your rights, who is going to protect your rights, right? Your culture, some of these inhabitants are indigenous people, your culture might disappear altogether, right? Because the culture is tied to the land that they inhabit. And if the state is no longer there, what happens to your nationality, right? Your right of self-determination to determine the political and the economic structures for you, what will happen to those, right? So at the individual level, your rights might be affected. At the collective level, your rights will be affected as well, right? So that's why I feel that the situation of small island states is unique, because the guardian of your rights could disappear, right? So in addition to the sort of the limitations of the human rights framework, this poses a real challenge to the international community. So that brings me to the North-South issue, because the contribution of small island states to climate change is pretty negligible, right? But the impact on them is pretty drastic. And it's no secret that the industrialized countries, with the US at the forefront, are the main contributors to climate change, right? But particularly the US has consistently tried to evade legal responsibility. But the legal framework tried to take this disparity in relation to both the contribution as well as the consequences into account when they designed the legal framework. So the common but differentiated responsibility principle on which the legal framework is based was a response to this disproportionate contribution as well as the impact. So the small island states have been consistently arguing that the northern states must take responsibility, must help these countries which are disproportionately affected by climate change because we have to decide at some point what happens to these communities, what happens to the citizens of small island states. It's well and good to say, sorry, international law doesn't have a legal framework, but at some point we'll have to relocate these people, right? So I think it took I think the very first report of the IPCC said, in 1990, mind you, that the greatest single impact of climate change may be on human migration. And it took us until 2015 to actually include that in the climate documents. That, I think, is a pretty long time. So I think in addition to dealing with the legal aspects, I think that we also need to look at this, the issue of resettling people. Can we look at the human rights framework to help us there? If we want to, I think we should rely on the human rights framework, but again, we run into this problem of the territoriality issue, the vertical nature of human rights, because these countries have consistently argued that asking them to rely on the human rights framework is to put an additional burden on these countries which hardly contributed to the problem, right? So we need something in addition to the human rights framework. Obviously, they recognize that in the short term, they do have to protect the rights of people, right, in terms of helping them to adapt, in terms of protecting them from severe weather events. But in addition to that, they need something from the international community in terms of funding, in terms of assistance, in terms of actually finding land to relocate these people. So the North-South issue is something that we should take into account, look at the main culprits or main contributors to the problem. I shouldn't use the word culprit because at some point we didn't know maybe that this was causing a lot of problems, but now we know, so ignorance is not a problem anymore or should not be an excuse anymore. So maybe we can look at the existing principles. I know the international community is rather reluctant to go for new treaties. So we do have quite a lot of principles that we can rely on. The common but differentiated responsibility principle is one. The justice framework is another, right? That takes the disproportionate contribution as well as the disproportionate impact on certain communities. The polluter pays principle, why cannot we rely on that? We know who the polluters are. What else? We do have, the collective responsibility of the international community. That's one of the principles on which the refugee framework is based. So can we look at that? Because the refugee framework recognizes that your state, either because it's the perpetrator or because it's not in a position to help you, the international community should bear or share the burden. So maybe we can look at that framework and that principle in relation to the small island states. But whatever said and done, I don't think we should allow these countries to cope with this problem by themselves. So to conclude, since my time is up, these small island states are at the mercy of the international community, because, especially the global north, who actually caused the problem. And they are being punished for something that they did not create. but the impact on them is catastrophic, right? Way disproportionate to their contribution to the problem. The future they face is bleak. They are going to lose everything they have, including their culture and identity. So we cannot let these people suffer simply because we don't have a legal framework to protect them, right? I personally believe that we created these legal principles, and statehood is a legal fiction we created. All these maritime boundaries, maritime zones are legal fictions that we created, right? There are no lines in the ocean, right? So I think we are smart enough as international lawyers, and it's a challenge to all of you, to come up with the legal framework and another legal fiction to accommodate this category of states and its people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Smadhu, and thank you to all of the panelists for keeping to time. That leaves us a good amount of time for questions from the audience. But just before I go to the audience, a number of times we've mentioned the UNFCCC, and loss and damage under the UNFCCC, but we haven't talked about it that much. I was wondering if anyone might like to give an opinion about whether or not they think that may be, I'm not going to say sufficient, because it's clearly not going to be, but is it something that's helpful in this question of disappearing states, to have those discussions at the UNFCCC? Anyone?
Well, Bryce, actually, I was hoping that you would answer your own question, because, I mean, the reason why the loss and damage is now integrated in the climate change regime is thanks to the strong fight of the Alliance of Small Island States, for which you work, if I understand well. So you could better than anyone understand what are the political underpinnings behind pushing forward that so much. As far as I understand, Annex 1 countries wanted to keep loss and damage within the adaptation framework, and I believe that there is a very important symbolic force to the fact that it is now a self-standing provision, not included or differentiated from climate change adaptation, although how it will be actually become into operation is still, is still a question. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about what was behind the negotiating.
I don't like these panels in which the tables are turned on the moderator. But if I'll just sort of briefly comment on this. So I think honestly, actually, small island states were not particularly focused on the potential extinction of states when they were pushing for action on loss and damage, but rather these states are seeing events like the hurricanes that we just had this last season in the Caribbean, which were making states temporarily uninhabitable. And understanding that went well beyond what they could adapt to, that they would just need to respond to that in some way. And so I think the discussion around loss and damage is that, but doesn't go as far as how do we deal, I think, one, with migration, but further, the extinction of states. And so I know that there are increasing discussions at the Warsaw International Mechanism, which is the institution that's supposed to deal with this. But I'm not actually sure that the small islands would be in favor of having those discussions of extinction within that context. Okay, so I'm going to open up the floor to questions. We'll take a few questions, then we'll have the panel answer. There are sorry, there's a very bright light, and I see most people over there. There's a microphone there, and there's one over on the other side. So go ahead.
Thank you, Peter Becker. I'm a Dutchman, and as you may be aware, the Netherlands knows a thing or two about protecting itself against the sea, as it has been situated
Could you
below
speak
sea
up-
level
Could
for...
you speak up just a little? Sorry.
Yes. So the Netherlands knows a thing or two about protecting itself from the sea, as it has, of course, been situated below sea level for centuries. My question is, has any thought been given to the creation of a Marshall Plan type rescue mechanism, not post-disaster, but pre-disaster, if you will, drawing on the technology developed by developed countries with relevant experience and the natural resource wealth of countries like Norway? And second, has any thought been given to requesting an advisory opinion from the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea in Hamburg or the International Court of Justice in The Hague, clarifying some of the international law issues arising in this context? As you know, the advisory jurisdiction of the ICJ has been invoked in the past in situations where the Security Council was unable or unwilling to act. Thank you.
Thank you. Christina?
Thank you. My name is Christina Vogt. I'm a professor at the University of Oslo in Norway, and I would like to thank all panelists for excellent discussions. I have a brief comment and a brief question. The comment refers to the reference to human rights in the preamble of the Paris Agreement, as Sumudu mentioned. In that reference, states are encouraged, or states should respect their respective human rights obligations when engaging in climate action. Now, there are two aspects that need to be highlighted here. One is that the Paris Agreement does not create any new human right. It is something that refers to existing or respective human rights obligations that states already have under custom or treaties. But the second aspect, I think is very important, is that particular reference is dynamic or includes a certain dynamism, which means that any development within human rights law would then be drawn in under the aspect or the umbrella of the Paris Agreement. And the question I have, I'm a little bit intrigued by disappearing territories due to the impacts of climate change and what it means for statehood. Now, I have a feeling that this may be the last question to be asked about statehood, because by the time lands disappear or are submerged, the people may already be gone. So the question of a permanent population may come up much earlier than the question of, is there still any defined territory? And protecting people and population may require very different measures than freezing territory boundaries or the like. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Jani Vremi. I'm from the Caribbean, and I was very happy to hear at the very end of the entire panel discussion some mention of what's happening to the Caribbean islands, some of which have become uninhabitable as a result of some of these hurricanes that ravaged our countries last year. So I wonder if the panel, I mean, it sounds as if you're speaking about this impending disaster that's going to take place. It's already taken place for some Caribbean islands, and I was wondering if the panel had anything to share about what we could learn about the Caribbean experience and whether there's ongoing discussions taking place on how to deal with people who have already been displaced by these disasters. Thank you.
Okay, so I think we'll go through that first round and then we'll have a second round of questions. So 4 questions. One about whether or not there's been sort of any thought given to essentially a Marshall Plan to, I would say, fortify the islands. Second, about an advisory opinion. The third, about Christina's question about, we may not actually sort of be dealing with disappearance of land, but prior to that, disappearance of a permanent population. And then lastly, noting that some of the things that we're talking about are already taking place. So what is happening currently to deal with particularly, I would say, migrating populations. So do you sort of want to, why don't we start at that end and move back this way?
Okay. Yeah, you get to hear from me again. Let's see. Marshall Plan to fortify the islands. I believe some of the islanders don't really want to move, particularly because, because of culture, because their ancestors have lived there for a long time. But they are also, they also acknowledge that for their children particularly and their grandchildren, they really need to think about the future. Again, I think this is also a funding issue because I'm not an engineer, but it'll take a lot of money to come up with seawalls, and some are actually looking into these issues. But the question is if these islands are going to disappear at some point. I mean, how effective are these plans going to be, and who is going to fund all this, right? Obviously, these islands don't have too much money lying around, and the Maldives actually constructed an artificial island. I don't remember the cost now, but it was millions of dollars. So that could be one option to look at, but again, money is the issue. Regarding an advisory opinion, I know that Palu, right, was looking at an advisory opinion requesting the General Assembly to request the ICJ for an advisory opinion. As far as I know, this request has not been forwarded to the ICJ. They have been talking about this for years, as far as I know. With regard to human rights and climate change in the Paris Agreement, I agree that, frankly, I wasn't too happy about the wording in the Paris Agreement, and as you probably know, the operative part relating to human rights was taken out during the last few days of the negotiations. But my position has been that, these obligations don't operate in a vacuum, whether or not there was a specific provision in the Paris Agreement about human rights. States have already accepted human rights obligations, which they have to fulfill, whether it's climate change or whether it's some other issue. They have to fulfill this, but they tend to forget that, they tend to think in silos. And it's a good point there to point it out that any developments in relation to human rights would be applicable in relation to climate change because it's a dynamic sort of provision. And yes, about people, there is consensus that because of these increasing storms and things like that, people will move long before the islands disappear. So we'll be looking more about, a permanent population as a criteria, a loss of a permanent population, than loss of territory. Caribbean islands, I don't know how long it will take for the international community, at least some members of the international community, to connect the dots that these severe weather events are occurring in frequency and in intensity because of climate change. There is a tendency not to connect it to climate change. And I think we need to come up with better plans to protect people, better plans to help people when these severe weather events happen. And Puerto Rico, some parts are still without electricity 6 months after the event. And definitely we haven't done enough to help these people. So I think we need to realize that it's only going to get worse. And we need to have better contingency plans in place to help people.
So on the question of a Marshall Plan pre-disaster, I wouldn't call this a Marshall Plan, but I know of some islands like Micronesia or Vanuatu, which are developing policies with support of some international organizations to look at better responses for displacement linked to storms, hurricanes, and also sudden but also slow onset environmental events. But as far as I know, none of these countries are looking at the possibility of disappearance. Again, they are looking at comprehensive policies to address the movement within the country, but they are not looking, as far as I know, at the disappearance of this country. So it's a yes that there is some preparations going on, but no that it's looking at a scenario where the country doesn't exist anymore, as far as I know. I mean, there's been a lot of this example of, I think it was Kiribati buying some land in Fiji. This has been seen as an emblematic and very symbolic measure. But again, as far as I know, maybe colleagues in the panel can confirm, I don't think this has been followed by like policy action at the national level. Maybe to respond to question 4, which could also be a bit of a response to question 3. So the lessons learned from the Caribbeans. I'm not just going to talk about the Caribbean events in the last year, but also what happened in Central America in the 1990s with Hurricane Mitch and so on. So there has been some, with each of this displacement situation linked to storms, hurricanes, and so on. I think there is more and more thinking around what do you do again with the people displaced, but not in the situation where the states disappear. But for instance, you have a lot of thinking around relocation of people away from areas which are being hit so many times by storms or hurricanes that it's not even worth leaving people there. There's a lot of discussions, but also development of practical guidelines, tools. UNHCR is being involved in that. You have Columbia University. I mean, quite a few people looking at this. And also some concrete examples of some countries, like Colombia, for instance, or someplace in Fiji, where populations are being relocated. However, again, we are talking here about relocation from one part of the country to another, and not to another state. That's it for me.
Yeah, thanks very much, and they were all very good questions. I think, as a starting point, I think we should recognize that there are political, economical, and political, economical reasons for why states very often do not take the steps that we think states ought to be taking. And also, I think there's a reluctancy sometimes to judicialize some of these problems. And you can map on these different obstacles, I think, to some of the questions that were posed. For instance, providing Marshall aid or a Marshall type of program to some of these countries would, of course, be very costly and would require political mobilization, which is just, in the current climate, very difficult. I think we should just acknowledge that. Having said that, of course, a lot of governments, including my own, spend a lot of money trying to aid governments in taking effective steps to combat climate change and combat some of these different things that we're seeing. So I think there are things being done, but to go beyond those things that we're now seeing happening requires more political will, more economic resources, and it's just very hard to mobilize. And I think all of us need to do a better job in trying to get states to be more effective in their responses. And I think the issue of an advisory opinion, again, it comes back to this issue of judicializing these questions. I think these are very complicated, very carefully calibrated questions. States are very often, as we all know, reluctant to give them to judicial organs, not knowing exactly what will come back. So as for now, I don't think it's feasible, at least in the short term, that this will go to the ICJ, but you never know. When it comes to the human rights, I think that's a particularly fascinating topic, and a lot of very important reflections were offered. Of course, human rights and the way human rights have traditionally been structured don't lend itself, or doesn't lend human rights to a very effective means for giving recourse to those who are suffering from climate change. Human rights being vertical structural instruments, where you have typically the classic human rights case is a clear violation on the part of the state, and of course the individual can then take on the state and take that that action or inaction to a independent judicial entity. I think, at least in the European context, we've seen a movement from just holding states responsible for their actions to holding states responsible for their inactions. And I think perhaps that could be something that could manifest itself also in this context. So for instance, in terms of, instead of just saying that the state is responsible or states are responsible for climate change, one could see cases coming up where one were to advocate that, where one could advocate that states have not taken sufficient safeguards to protect people from the effects of climate change, for instance, so-called passive obligations on the part of states. And I think that's something that we could see more of going forward. When it comes to the last question about the impending nature of climate change and some of the security implications, I agree that it could almost sound arrogant to talk about these things as impending threats when we know that the Caribbean was just hit by hurricanes and many people were killed and displaced and so forth. But I think at least my topic was about the Security Council, and I do think that when it comes to the Security Council, at least, and other entities in the international community, very often what's required is to have manifest physical, tangible consequences of these terrible things, and you need to see them right before you, and there needs to be a clear linkage between what's happening and the reasons behind it. So for instance, going back to the resolution I talked about with regards to HIV and the Ebola episode, there you had thousands of people dying, and it was a very clear cause or reason for why they were dying. And I think it's for us who care about these things to showcase how climate change is now impacting communities and so forth. And if we can show a clear linkage between climate change and the terrible consequences that it imposes on people, I think that we could expect more action on behalf of governments and also international entities such as the Security Council.
So, with regards to the first question, I think I completely agree with Andreas. I cannot add much to it except just a few examples of cases that I know Pacific Island states have used and benefited from technology developed elsewhere in developed countries. I think that the construction of the seawall that currently protects the Maldives capital, Malé, is one of those examples, or also the protection of Mahuros, the capital of Marshall Islands, Mahuros Airport is another example. All of these measures were implemented with a lot of help from, I think, Japanese technology in particular. When it comes to the advisory opinion question, indeed, as has been mentioned before, Palau pushed for an advisory opinion to be requested by the General Assembly to the ICJ in 2011. And in the end, from what I know, because of diplomatic pressure exerted in particular by the United States, it did not move forward. Of course, when it comes to any advisory opinion or any ICJ case, it all comes down to how you frame the question. And in this case, I believe that the question was framed in a way that was very sensitive because it raised issues of international legal responsibility and potential requests for reparation or compensation, which is of course something that developed industrialized countries want to avoid as much as possible. And I think actually in the one of the caveats to the inclusion of Article 8 on loss and damage in the Paris Agreement was a declaration from Annex 1 countries that says that this should not be read as implying potential, like liability or something. Well, you can explain better than me. Another comment with regards to the advisory opinion question is that these movements, which are very blunt political movements, just as these development of the securitization narrative you so well described at the Security Council, and also, by the way, between 2007 and 2011, there was in between the General Assembly resolution on climate change and its possible security implications, which was adopted and which was pushed forward by Pacific Island states. These movements are happening in parallel to the development of the climate change regime. And from the reading of the verbatim records of these three instances you mentioned, I understood that a lot of the position expressed by different states at the Security Council when discussing, about the security implications of climate change, were actually influenced by their positions in the parallel climate change negotiations in 2006, 2007 was after the Bali Roadmap, and when all political attention was focusing on getting on the preparation of the Copenhagen conference and on getting that post-2012 new agreement adopted. Of course, at the end it was unfortunately that failed, and so there is always this reluctance of states from all different political groups to any parallel discourses that arise outside of the climate change negotiations. When it comes to the third question on what comes first and what's more important, should we focus first on the permanent population requirement before dealing with the defined territory requirement of Article 1 of the Montevideo Convention? There is, it's a very good question. It has actually been one of the dividing lines between scholars that have been writing about these questions. My position is that territory comes first, but why so? Because it's where the population gets their livelihoods from. Territory is not just the physical, it doesn't only define the physical existence of the state, it is also the source of the source of the livelihoods where, for the population. So deterritorialization eventually becomes the source of population movements. And when when you think of deterritorialization, it's not just full submergence. Before full submergence occurs, there is a whole range of socioeconomic impacts derived from deterritorialization. For instance, sea level rise not only affects the legal baseline, the actual baseline or the legal baseline, it actually provokes the salinization of the coast. These Pacific Island states rely very heavily on coastal agriculture. Eventually, sea level rise provokes food insecurity. As food insecurity increases, population displacement is triggered first internally and eventually also at the transnational level. But perhaps this dichotomy between what comes first, permanent population or defined territory, is in the end only an academic debate. In fact, Pacific Island states are dealing with both issues at the same time. They're actually tackling both questions at the same time. So in 2012, at the same time when Kiribati was concluding 7 maritime delimitation agreements at once in August 2012, and 2 years later concluded this purchase of land in Fiji, of 2 hectares of land in Fiji, allegedly to promote coastal agriculture there, but eventually also as a potential place where part of Kiribati population could move. At the same time, it was conducting or concluding migration agreements with Australia and New Zealand, which were not framed as environmental, refugees or climate change displaced people agreements. They are simply migration agreements. But the government was, taking the measures at the same time on both grounds. When it comes to the question of Caribbean island states, I personally haven't focused that much on this region for one main reason, which is that from what I could observe at the Copenhagen conference, at the plenary, the Caribbean doesn't have a unified regional position as Pacific Island states have. And perhaps this, explains to some extent why I don't think we have seen either a regional unified position of Caribbean states before the Security Council. I think in general, Cuba, for instance, was very much under Bolivian influence, and that may have shaped, some of its political positions. So that's all I have.
Okay, let me make just two very brief comments before we wrap up. So on the question of the Marshall Plan, I think as Andrea suggested, this is entirely, I think, about funding. We have the Green Climate Fund, which is currently, although it has a significant amount of money, is still much less than what it would need to be if we were to actually deal with all of the adaptation needs of countries. Very recently, Nauru applied to rebuild and strengthen its port, its only port actually. And although it was eventually approved, the political process was, it was quite hard, yeah, we'll say it that way. On the advisory opinion, so the 2011 Palau request for an advisory opinion, I think was explicitly a political question. And it was also tied up in the US attempting to ratify finally UNCLOS. But I think this sort of explicit political nature of it was one of the reasons that it really didn't go forward. And so an advisory opinion framed in a different way, maybe framed around this question of, does the extinction of states have the same characteristics as the creation of states, may garner sufficient support. So I'd like to thank everyone for coming today, for asking questions, for our 4 excellent panelists, for their presentations. Again, to Julian, who organized the panel, and to ASIL for having us. Thanks, everyone, and have a good day.